Okay. And once this video is done recording, I'll upload it to YouTube so you can watch it again later. I will also, I haven't got it worked out just yet. We used to have WebEx, which is how I would broadcast to all of your screens. We've switched to Zoom, and I only kind of understand how to use it. So today felt like that's one extra thing to throw into the hoopla that was just going to make it too confusing. So I'll just record it today, and I'll go kind of slow because we're not going to be going over tons of stuff. Today I am 2G. So opening up Toon Boom Harmony. Did that work? Still didn't work. Yeah, that's something with this computer. Plug that in the wall. This little grip back on the back. So there, you pull up on those, you should be able to. Did that change anything? Yeah, because she kind of borrow like something to kind of watch in case you see it close. And I'll put this on the list. What's the computer number on this one? This is 29508. I will let some people know, and we'll try to see if we can get that working by next class period.
Okay, 2959.
Okay, so I know this is, I know there's a lot of bugs in here today. That's the first day of every digital media class. So we'll work those out. But yeah, if you want to peek over shoulders here and sort of follow along, or just sort of watch up on the screen. So we're going to open Toon Boom. Some of you maybe already have. That's okay, but it's going to ask you some questions at the beginning that are actually pretty important questions. So again, if you start typing Toon Boom, you're going to be let down. So what we have to actually start typing is Harmony. So here's the way to think of it. Maya is Autodesk Maya. Autodesk is the company that owns it. Maya is the software package, right? Toon Boom is the company. And it used to be a software package too. Toon Boom was like an animation software. But now Harmony is actually what we're using. More people say Toon Boom animator, so it's kind of becomes like in our colloquialisms here. But if we just start typing Harmony, what we're looking for is Harmony Premium. Now, has anybody in here never used Maya? Anybody? So I don't want to make. Have you used Maya? Yeah, so I just don't want to make comparisons to some software package some of you may have not tried. I think everybody's at least had to open it, right? So thank you for using Harmony Premium. Okay, so we're going to have to think about this in a similar way, right? Just like in Premiere or in Maya, not all of the files are saved in your in your actual file, right? Like if you save a Premiere project, the PRPOG, whatever, J file, there's no videos in there, right? The videos are still other assets that are outside of that. Your Premiere file is just how you've edited those assets together, right? The same with Maya. If you apply a texture map, you download some brick texture off the internet, you apply a texture map to a model inside of Maya, That texture map lives outside of your Maya file, right? It's just referencing that in. The same thing is happening in Toon Boom. Like, actually a lot of it. Every line you draw generates an additional file outside, well, not every line, every drawing you draw generates an additional file outside of Toon Boom that's actually the equivalent to like an Illustrator file. So what you're doing is making hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Illustrator files, or vector files. So what it's asking you right now is a very important question. Where do you want me to put all that junk? Right, that's what it's asking. Where should I dump all of these things? And your answer to this is significant, because if you just copy like the Harmony file somewhere and try to open it, it's going to go looking for all those drawings, and if they're not in the place it's looking for it, you just lost everything. Okay? So you should always think of this in the same way you think of setting your project in Maya. So I'm going to go ahead and create a scene, but I'm going to figure out where I want to put it first. For me, I'm going to go ahead and put it on my D drive just while I'm working. Let's see if I have some stuff in here. Greg in class, that looks like me. Select folder, and we'll call this, for me, I'm going to call this first day. Okay? Create scene. So it's thinking about it. Not responding. There we go. It's responding now. Oh, you know what I just realized? I'm capturing the wrong screen for you to be able to see it, aren't I? I bet I need to see what I can do here. Because I'm going to have to be able to draw. So, identify, I'm going to just clone this. Okay, so make sure it's working. So Toon Boom is going to be a little confusing on day one. We're not going to go into everything. I'm not going to dig into every element of this interface. The biggest thing we're going to talk about today is just some timeline stuff and some drawing stuff. Obviously, we have the menu up here across the top. A couple of other things that are worth thinking about is, you see where it says default here? This is our layout of our space. So if I click on this, I can switch over to hand-drawn, and it's going to rearrange my entire interface to sort of lend itself to hand-drawn animation. Yes?
What was hand-drawn?
It's this little drop-down box right here, right below your menu. Mine was set to default.
Yeah, okay.
So you can try out some different ones, see if you like any of them better than the other, but you'll see what it's doing is it's really just taking all of the interface elements and moving them around. For right now, I'm going to go ahead and put mine back in default, and it may be easier for you to follow along if yours is also in default, but recognize that it's very customizable. If you find that you like working in a certain way, set it up that way. Okay. The main thing we're going to look at today, we got our tools along the side, right, our toolbar, and you'll notice a couple of things. We have the move tools that are very similar to what you would see in Illustrator or Photoshop, right? You can select things, and as you see, we have the option to select, and then below here, this is the contour editor. So this is just like in Illustrator where you can select the whole object, or you can select an element of that object, like a tangent or a vertex. I guess it's not a vertex, it's a Bezier point, right, in Illustrator. You'll also see we have a couple of drawing tools, right? We have a brush, a pencil, and an eraser. So let's just click on one of these. I'm going to go ahead and select maybe the selection tool. Now you'll see what I do over here in my tools properties, I get all of these different options related to these tools. Right? we're going to dig into these much more deeply, but there's some really neat stuff just kind of hidden in here. Everything from being able to select all of your visible drawing layers at once with this tool. There's also, what is this here? Applied line and color art. So there's like options for the select tool that are over here. And so tool properties is something you're going to be looking at quite a bit, particularly if you're going to be drawing something, right? So let's look at our brush. So I want you to notice a couple of things about this brush. First is we see vector brush properties. We're drawing in vector, okay? So that may be scary to some of you. How many of you don't like Illustrator? You're not an Illustrator fan, okay, cool. That scares people off. They're like, vector, ugh, I don't like vector. That's fine, because Toon Boom is actually raster, vector, or both at the same time. Photoshop is raster, Illustrator is vector. So some people don't want to work in Toon Boom because they enjoy drawing in Photoshop better. We can actually create a new layer that's a raster layer, and we get a different set of brushes. So the cool thing about these brushes is if I go drawing with one of them, right, actually let me do that with my pen over here. You'll see that, you know, if I'm drawing light, it's kind of thin. If I push, it gets a little thicker, thins back out. Right? The cool part about this is completely endable, right? If I go back to my selection tool, I can select the entire thing, I can move it around, I can scale it. None of this is ever going to get pixelated, right? If I go back to my contour selection tool, you'll see that I still have all of the vector elements that go into this. So I can actually just click on a point of the line and just start reshaping this into a blob, right? So I'm working in vector, but I'm not having to, like, I think what everybody thinks when they hear vector is that means you have to draw everything with the pen tool where you click and drag a Bezier and like you're making these very perfect, precise shapes. You can draw in vector in this in a very loose, gestural way. And in fact, it's actually pretty, let me get back to my, like it's pretty responsive, right? And there's a lot of different options over here for how you want your vector brush to look. And some of them start to, even though this is vector, some of them start to look less like a vector line, right? Now this is still a vector shape, it's just filled in a way that makes it feel like something more of a brush, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and circle everything here and delete it. Now, there's a slight difference between our brush and a pencil. So let's grab the pencil really quick, and I want to show you some pretty neat tools with this, right? So let's say I'm going to draw a box, right? I'm going to do, can you see that up there? And make it just a little bit bigger. Okay, so I have a box here. If I go to my selection tool, let me draw something with my brush too, just so you can see this. Now, let's go back to one of those standard ones. So the difference between these pencil drawings over here and this brush drawing is that when I'm drawing with the brush, I'm drawing an enclosed shape. See that? When I'm drawing with my pencil, I'm drawing a line that has a thickness on its rendering, right? So visually they don't look that much different until I start messing with the shape, right? One of the beneficial parts about doing a line with your pencil though is that there's some cleanup tricks that you can do with this, right? I'm just trying to get this out of the way. If I click on my arrow here, the top arrow, the select tool, you'll see that I get this cutter option. This is one of the things that I actually really love about Toon Boom. is that with this cutter tool, I can now clean up my box pretty quickly. I just click and drag, and it'll eliminate anything at a trim point. So I can very quickly start getting some pretty clean line work. Now, if we zoom in here kind of closely, you'll see that each of these is still an individual line, right? Again, like in Photoshop, if you hold down the space bar, you can sort of move your whole page. But each of these is now an individual line. And if I wanted to fill this or encompass or use a fill bucket to fill this with a color, I can do that. I can use the fill bucket, and I can click that and fill it with a color. Now, if I go back to my select tool, you'll see that I have a couple of things. I have this fill, right, this shape that I just filled it in, right? And that is made up out of a whole bunch out of a vector shape, just like we would get with the paintbrush. Right? And then I also have each of these vector lines, right? Okay. This this alone may not seem like that big of a deal, but this makes it makes Toon Boom like my preferred place to illustrate things. Like that trim feature, like I don't like if I'm actually needing to draw something that needs to be inked, I draw it in Toon Boom even if I have no plans on ever turning this into something animated. So if we go to a pencil, I can very quickly draw whatever shape I want. Go in here to my cutter tool. Oh, that's hard to do. And start trimming off these pieces. And it's very easy to quickly get something that cleans up, right? And you can start thinking about your drawing differently, right? I have a character with a nose out here. Let's do some eyeballs, right? That's really ugly. I get my trimmer, or my cutter tool here. Why is that not working? And I can trim that. And I can start very quickly getting those shapes that I need to get in here a little more cleanly. Now, I do want to show you that, like I showed earlier with that box, you're going to end up with some stuff that's not connected. And sometimes you want it to be connected. All right, so if I did this, right, and then cutter, trimmed all of these off. Again, that's 4 shapes, and if I zoom in here really closely, you can see that they're all like disconnected, right? So if I go back to my selection tool and select all of these and find it again right here. This little band-aid on the line thing here over in my tools property, if I click that, it will connect all of them together. And so now what I have is a single unbroken curve, right? Yes? It's the one, it's over in your tools property, it's the one that looks like a line with a little band-aid across it. Okay. So, in my head, and it doesn't have to be this way, but in my head, the pencil is how I create my line work, right? The brush is how I create any fills or shapes that are going to be solid. Now you can do kind of both ways, just like in Illustrator, you can add a stroke to the outside of a shape, or you can fill an enclosed area, right? But the way I usually like to work is I do a sketchy version of my animation, and then I do a cleaner inked-in version of the line work, and then I do my color pass where I do my fills. So let's talk about color just briefly. If I go over here to my, right below my tools properties, you'll see that I have this vast selection of 6 colors, right? So let's just go with red. Red's easy to see, right? So as I have this selected, if I click on different things, you'll see that it changes the color of that thing. So I'm going to go back to black, and I'm just going to go ahead and deselect it. and go to red. So now I have the color red selected, and I can use my fill bucket to just paint the inside of that box red. Now, again, in terms of this being an object, you need to realize that this is two different things, right? I have my lines and I have my fill. Okay? Now, I'm not going to get into this too much, but this is actually beneficial to have it this way. I'm sure, like, your first thoughts are like, that's just two things to keep up with, right? For each object, I have to think of my lines and my color. Why this is beneficial is because those can be manipulated in different ways, right? For example, don't sweat this too much. If I wanted to just paint part of my, I don't want to do that right now. If I just wanted to paint on top of my color here, I can do that. I just have to separate that out into a different layer. So this may be a good time to go ahead and talk about this. This is a little bit complicated, right? Because what we're seeing right here, if you'll notice in your these two tabs across the top, we have our camera and then we have our drawing, right? So like, what's the difference? That's where this starts getting complicated. And really it only gets complicated if you are sort of clinging on to other software packages and how they identify these things, right? Your camera is what you are going to see at the end of this, or at least a preview of it, right? What is the audience seeing is your camera. Your drawing is a separate thing. Your drawing is I mean, they named it pretty well. Think of it as an actual drawing, a piece of paper, right? And so if I click on drawing, you'll see that it looks the same right now. In fact, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of tear off my camera view and see if I can put that beside. Can I do that? Put this beside drawing. No. Yeah, on this side. There we go. So now I have my camera and my drawing side by side. Right. So I can reuse this drawing multiple times across multiple elements in weird ways. This drawing could be a mask for something else. This drawing could be something we never actually see. It's only used to add texture to something else. But right now, what we're seeing is this drawing on frame 1 of our timeline. And we'll get to our timeline here in a second. So I'm going to just select that little color box in the center. Right? And you'll see that anything I affect the drawing over here also affects the camera. You can tell the camera is the one that has the gray background. So when you look over in drawing, you'll see that I have these 3 buttons across the side. There's this eyeball, there's this little box that says L, and this little box that says C, right? If I click on C, my drawing disappears. If I go back to L, my drawing comes back. So what we actually have here, and this is where it gets a little confusing, these are layers. These are drawing layers, okay? So, what we are able to do is for every drawing, we're able to have up to 4 layers that are all embedded into that drawing, right? So right now, all my color, this red box, and the line work, these black lines, are both on the L layer. So I'm going to select the red box itself. You'll see that's what I have, right? And I'm just going to hit Control X. And then I'm going to go to the C layer, and I'm going to hit Control V. So now what you'll see is over here in my camera, I'm able to see them both, right? But the line work is there on this L layer, and the color work is on the C layer. Right? This allows me to separate my color from my lines. I can actually add 2 additional layers to this, and I'll show you some of that later, but right now let's don't get too confused. Just think about this as a way that we can keep our line work separate from our color work. Now, why that's important is because I want to sometimes be able to make mass changes to just one or the other, right? For example, let's say I wanted to add a shadow to this red. Well, I'm going to go over here, and we're going to talk about our palettes a little bit more in the future, but our palettes exist so we make sure that everything is consistent, right? So let's say all of the time every time I draw this box, I always want it to be the same red, right? If I always make sure I fill it with this red color, then I'm never going to have any inconsistencies. I don't have to use the eyedropper to try to figure out which red this is. And that's pretty important, right? Homer is always the same color of yellow, right? Homer always wears the same color of pants, right? And in any production, you're going to want to be able to share these. Now, these palettes are something you can save out. You can give to someone else so they can be use those on their animations. And you can name them, right? I'm going to go to green here, though, and I'm going to name this one Red Shadow. And then for the color of that, if I double click on this, I'll use my eyedropper. Got to click it and drag it to sample this red. And so my red shadow is now the same color. I'm just going to add a little bit more darkness to it. I'll take it just a little darker. Maybe like that, right? And so if I close that, now my red shadow is a little darker. Now, if I go in here with my paintbrush on my color layer, I can start adding this darker color of red. And look what's happening here. Back to eyeball. It's going underneath the lines, but on top of the red, right? So when I'm in the color layer, the eyeball, if you have the eyeball unchecked, it means that in your drawing layer, you're only going to see whichever layer you have selected, right? So I'm actually going to undo that. But you can see what we're getting there. The darker red is going underneath the lines, but on top of the color, right? Now, why this becomes pretty important is there's additional tools down here. So if we see this button right here, this paintbrush, the Repaint Brush, this is in our Tools property underneath our brushes. If I click that, I can go in here and paint, and it's only going to show up on parts that have already been painted before. And so I can pretty quickly go in here and get some interesting cell shading on this. Okay, so that's one of the reasons we have those broken up into layers and why we can go into the drawing versus the camera. So I like keeping them both open. This is a pretty good way of drawing. I'm going to zoom out here a little bit. Okay. So, the really hard part about teaching Toon Boom is that there's a lot of words in it, or a lot of names in it, that are not what you would expect them to be, right? So when I say a drawing, I'm talking about a literal vector illustration that lives as a standalone piece within the program, right? However, you'll see that down here on my timeline, I have a drawing, or I have like a frame there, right? If I move my timeline later, you can see that little gray box there is where I just drew our red box, right? This is confusing because this box on our timeline is just an exposure. I'm exposing this drawing to the viewer, right? And I can reuse that 100 times, right? I could reuse it never again, or I could not use it at all. I could never expose that drawing. That drawing could just be reference for me to look at later, right? So it's going to get a little confusing as we go along, as I use these words interchangeably. I'll try my best to use the correct terminology for it. But today is going to be one of the more confusing days in terms of the names of stuff. Little bits at a time, how this works will start to make sense to you. Okay. So we're into the timeline now. Let's go ahead and hop in there in just a second. But before I do that, how y'all feeling so far? Is it getting a little overwhelming? Okay. Can anybody sum up what's overwhelming? Like what's the parts that are confusing?
I think there's like so much on the screen at once in terms of tools. Like I feel like these are going to be lost in a little bit.
Fair enough. So let me try to backtrack a little bit and talk about those. So there's really only, I guess there is 6 things on here that we're looking at. There's our tools over here, right? And then all the way in the top corner over here, these are the properties of whatever tool you have selected, okay? So sometimes that's how I like to think of stuff as track down what I'm looking for, right? If you want to recolor, like how I did that cell shading on the red, if I want to recolor that, where would I find that option? That's an attribute of my brush, right? That is the way my brush is working. And so that means I would find that in the properties of my brush, right? The color palettes are just below those properties. So these 2 things in the middle, how about that? Is that feeling confusing, the difference between the camera and the drawings?
Yeah, a little bit. My brain is having, I guess, a hard time comprehending that one only has lines and one has cell shading, but that one to the left has both, and the one to the right just has lines, the background's white. Mm-hmm. And that's too much for my brain.
Fair enough. So, I wanted to see if there's a way I could sum this up in a better way. So, the way you can think about these layers that are in our drawing mode, so our drawing mode is just so we can see what's going on behind the curtains, right? The only thing the audience will ever see is what is in the camera mode, the one in the gray background, right? That's the only thing that will, huh?
The gray one.
The gray one is the camera. That is what will eventually render out for the audience to see, okay?
What color would the gray be when you render it?
Actually, in this case, strangely enough, it renders as black. It's showing it as gray, but we can put a color background back there to make that work. So what we're seeing in the camera is just what's being exposed on our timeline, okay? And the only thing being exposed on the timeline right now, that little frame right there, that we don't call that a drawing on here, this is an exposure of a drawing. The only thing that is being exposed on that drawing, or the only thing that is being exposed in this layer is this drawing that we're seeing here, right, in our drawing mode. So it's showing us the lines and the color layer. Now, if you think of the drawing as a drawing on a piece of paper, that's just one layer. So instead, maybe think of this as if the way a 2D animation really was, which was like cells, like a clear piece of plastic that you've drawn on top of. Imagine that this drawing is actually one clear piece of plastic with inked lines on it and one clear piece of plastic with color underneath it, right? And if you stapled those 2 things together and hung that on your wall, that's a drawing, right? So what we're seeing is we're exposing both layers of that on our timeline to the audience on frame 1. Is that helping any at all?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
You know how in Maya you could split up your panels like that to be like, this is what it looks like while I'm working on it, but then here's what it's going to look like when it's done?
Yes.
Is that what that's doing?
Yes. So
just adjust one of them?
you can think of it that way. Really, on our drawing, the one with the white background, think of that as seeing it in the wireframe view. And you know in Maya, when you can do the Arnold render preview, where it's like giving you a preview of what the render is going to look like, that's what we're seeing over here. Right, this is the lighted, shaded version of it. Now, it's not completely finished. Like some things are still not going to show up in our camera view because it would slow it down too much. So we can render out the final thing, but this is like the hardware render of it. If you want to see what it's actually going to look like, If you click this little blue flower down here at the bottom, that's what it's actually going to render out like. Which is a little annoying because our lines are black and now the background's black and you can't really see the lines. I'll show you how to fix that in a minute. But one is the OpenGL view and one is the render view. Yes?
So how did you change the color? How did you get that red shadow?
Oh, so what I did there is one of my swatches, remember this one was green, right? I just double clicked it, changed the name, and then double clicked the color part. And then I used my eyedropper to sample the original red, and I just made it a little darker. I could have picked any color I wanted to. So the cool part about that is if I, like this stays consistent throughout the entire project, right? And if, let's say, halfway through your project, at the end of the semester, you're going to be making a short film, and your short film is going to be about a little blue dinosaur, and suddenly somebody realizes, hey, wait, blue means sad. Maybe we should make it a little yellow dinosaur, or make it a little like whatever dinosaur. You don't have to start over, right? Like you can go in here and just change this color swatch to whatever you want it to. So my red, I could go in here and change that to purple. And now that's going to change wherever I use that red swatch. Okay? I'm not going to do that though, that's neat. Okay, but how I got it to only stay on the red box is I went to my color lines here, and under the paint brush, I chose this little paint brush that has the plus sign on it. So that's the repaint brush, and that means it's only going to apply paint to a shape that already exists, right? So I can paint all day long out here in this open space, nothing's going to happen. But as soon as I paint across something, it will change it. Does that make sense? Yes.
I don't really understand. What are the 3 tabs that you've been going back and forth between?
3 tabs. These 3?
The add tabs under drawing.
Oh, these here.
Yeah, and when I do it on my screen, it's put, like I have them on the camera side, but they're not on the drawing side. So it's just confusing.
Oh, well that may be, I think this part is movable.
Okay, but it still affects.
Yes. It should only show it in your drawing layer though. I may be wrong.
Okay.
So to kind of summarize these up again, you have your 2 different layers. So the second 2 lines, this little box with the L on it, that is your line layer. So layer 1, layer 2. And they call this your color layer. You don't have to use them just for that, but that's what most people would think of. This is where you would put your line work. Underneath that is where you put your color work. If the eyeball is turned on, no matter which of these you are currently on, you'll be able to see them both. And so when I turn the eyeball off, it just lets me see one at a time.
That makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. So again, all of that though is just compiled into this one drawing. Okay. Other questions? Okay. So, one more step of complication for you, okay? But this is actually complication number 1. Actually, let me answer this really quick. I think this is a guy coming to my house to fix my door. Hello? So we bought new doors for our house, and after they installed them, one of them had like a little bubble in the paint. So a guy's coming to like fix it because doors are expensive. So that was Andrew. He's going to be there between 11 and 12 tomorrow. So just letting you know. So, okay. One level more of not complication, but like complexity. And I swear, like this will take you just a little, bless you.
Thank you.
This will take you a little while to get your head wrapped around it, but it will make sense, right? Bless you.
Thank you.
So, let me pull up a picture here. Just any picture will do. It's a picture of some cows in my backyard. So, this is the drawing, right? Like imagine this is the image that we're seeing there, that box, right? And my phone is currently exposing it to the audience, right? You are able to see that, right? No, like, imagine I had more layers back here or whatever, that's fine. This layer that we're seeing down here on our timeline, where it says drawing, right here, that layer is capable of being moved as well, right? So I have a drawing on my screen right now, right? But imagine my phone is the layer. I can move that around however I want to, right? So this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. If I want to move this shape, right, I can always use this tool to select my line and my fill, right, and move it. Actually, this is where some of these tools become handy, because if I pick, let's see, apply to line and color art, then I can use over here, I can select them both and move them around, right? But what I'm doing is I'm moving the actual location of that line and that fill on my drawing, right? So imagine like a character's face, and I wanted to make their eyes slightly further apart, right? I can select that part of the eye and move it a little bit. However, the drawing itself, or the drawing layer, right? Let's call this box layer, right? That box layer has a pivot point and a location as well, right? So if I never moved those lines themselves, I can still move the layer. And there's a couple of different ways I can do that. One is through this little thing right here, this little box, third one up. And if I click that, you'll see that I'm able to sort of move this object around. You'll also see this little blue dot over there. That's that object's pivot point. Now this is cool to be able to move it like this, but up here at the top, we have a move, a rotate, a scale, skew, all of these, right? And so if I click move, you'll see that's my object's pivot point, and I can move, not the object, my layer's pivot point, and I can move it from that, or I can rotate it from that. Right? And what I'm actually moving is the layer. Again, it's as if I am moving my phone around, right, or rotating my phone. I'm not rotating the picture on here, I'm rotating the phone itself, right? So, I know that's a little confusing. Don't sweat that part just yet. But know that that part exists, because that part is what makes Toon Boom extremely beneficial, extremely versatile, right? Because that means we can have whatever animation we want happening on this timeline, and then I can move the timeline. I can alter, I can skew, I can rotate that timeline, I can do whatever I want to it, right? So, okay. I want to show you one more thing that's kind of neat. I'm going to go back to my brush tool. So this layer, my box layer, I know it's kind of hard to see up here. I'll get the zoom thing working where you can see it on your desktop for next class period. If you look right above that layer, there's this little plus sign. And if I click that, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of other things I can create. Okay? The one I want you to notice, though, is drawing. And if I click drawing, I can create a new drawing, but notice what I have options for here. My line art can be either vector or bitmap, and my color art can be either vector or bitmap. Now, just a little disclaimer or warning, I guess. I almost always choose vector. And I know the temptation to go to bitmap or to go to raster because you can get so much texture and all of that in there, but go home and watch a dozen cartoons and see how many of them are done in watercolor. Almost none. That's because you have to do 24 images for a second of animation. So we have to start thinking a little bit in terms of style. But some of you are going to want that sort of sketchy feel, especially for us, especially for your early sketches, right? So I'm going to go ahead and just create a new layer that has bitmap for my color and my line art. I'll say add and color. Well, let's do this as a bitmap test. Add. And so now I have this bitmap test. You'll see I have these little eyeballs out here on the end. I'll go ahead and hide my, box layer. Right? And you'll notice that some of my tools don't exist anymore. Because when I'm doing bitmap, I can't do a fill, right? That's going to be a raster fill, and a vector fill doesn't really work that way. You'll also notice that, like, really the only thing I can do is with this brush, but I get a lot of brush options that are very, very much like stuff you would get out of Photoshop. Right? And if I go in here and start drawing with this, it's going to feel. Oh, take it off that, whatever that was again, what's it called? Repaint Brush. And so you'll start to feel like this is much more like painting or sketching in Photoshop, right? However, like, if I zoom in here, eventually we'll start to see the pixels, okay? Yes.
My lines keep disappearing.
Is it, the little plus sign on the brush, underneath your brush right over here?
Where?
So under your tools property, underneath it, there's the little brush with a plus sign next to it. Try unchecking that and see if that.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So that was that repaint thing we turned on earlier. So there's going to be a lot of that. Toon Boom has got so many little things that you'll turn on and you'll be like, why can't I just choose my lines? It's because we told it to choose line and color art earlier, right? So there's going to be little things that you may forget and turn on and forget to turn off. But this raster brush, if what you like doing is very sketchy, loose, messy lines, that's awesome. Do it, right? That is perfectly fine. Vector is going to be probably what we go to get that final illustration for each of your frames. But raster exists in there. And there's nothing that says you can't do an entire sketchy, like rough line, like crayon animation, right? That is a style choice. So raster exists in here. Most people, because of the way that the style choices that most people make for animation, they usually end up going vector because it's easier to work with or easier to rework, I guess is a better way of saying it. But recognize that you can do all the brushes that you have in Photoshop, you can do something pretty close to that in here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this bitmap test. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and delete my box layer as well. And I'm going to create a new layer, drawing. I'll go ahead and do vector, vector. And I'll do ball lobes. So y'all probably know where this is going. So I wanted to give you an exercise before next class period to be working on. Something that I think is achievable, but it will kind of force you to use Toon Boom in the way that that will help you learn it the best, right? I just want you to create a bouncing ball animation. Bouncing in place, up and down, right? It just has to be one bounce, and it would loop infinitely, right? So, my guess, let me pull this a little closer, and you can do this however you want to. I would prefer it to have a color and an art layer, but what I would like you to do is, using the pencil, maybe black here, draw your first ball. Yes?
Can you do the onion spin?
The what?
The onion spin?
Oh, yeah, I'll show you that here in a second. I'm going to go ahead and span this back out. That's a good point. So I'm going to draw the...
Or is it called a light table?
Yeah, it's a light table. So I'm going to draw that first ball, right? And then I'm going to maybe do mine, let's say, I'm probably going to do mine about 24 frames, okay? So I can sort of scale my timeline in here. That's frame 25. Wait, no, yeah, 25. And Charlie asked about the onion skinning. So if we click this button right here, this is going to show our onion skinning. Can you all see that on the? Yeah. It's this all the way down at the bottom, right there. So that's going to turn on your onion skinning. And then to be able to see it in this layer, you have to click this little bitty stack of pancakes. So you'll be able to see this little thing you can drag along the top until you see the, and this little thing along the top is sort of the beginning and the ending of your time slider. So, sorry, I did this wrong. I probably took that too far. So you can do like a few frames before, a few frames after, and you'll see like, you can start seeing your onion skinning. So for frame 24, I would pretty much want that same drawing.
Are we able to move frames around like freely?
So what I'd like you to try in this one, just for exercise, is try drawing every circle, okay? Because that is actually going to be one of the challenging parts of this, right? If I know it's 24 frames long, I can go to frame 12. You can move them around, but like, oh, that's rough. So that's way too big, right? There we go. So it's getting closer. Maybe for this first one, yeah, you can like scale it or do a little bit of whatever you want to. What I do want you to try to do though is get in the habit of redrawing each shape, right? So again, for the bouncing ball, if you're curious about the frames that you're going to need for that, it's always easy to find some bouncing ball images. There we go. But again, just bouncing straight up and down. So this is going to be most of your poses, right? We need to think about how it eases in at the top, like the distance it travels as it's getting closer to the ground is a bigger distance. The distance it's traveling at the top is a smaller distance, right? And for this, I'm going to go ahead and draw my squashed version. I'm just using the pencil. I'm going to try to preserve volume just a little bit. That's probably a little too big.
This is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be.
Uh-huh. So one of the reasons I'm having you do that is because of that, right? I want you to practice redrawing this ball over and over again and getting the hang of how this works inside of Toon Boom. Now this top drawing up here, you can, if you want to, copy your first drawing and paste it over there. So in my timeline, if I right click on this and say copy cells from timeline, and then I go out here to the end and say paste cells in the timeline. So now I have that end drawing there as well, right? But really, like most of this is going to be the same drawings. You can duplicate some of them, but the thing that you want to watch out for, though, is you'll see that between frames 1 and frames 12 is really just one long frame that one long drawing that I'm holding the exposure on, right? So what I'm going to need to do there is click either create an empty drawing, this little button right here, or this button right here. I'm sorry, not that one. Create empty drawing. Yeah, let's do that one. Create an empty drawing, right?
Is there a shortcut key for that?
There is, and I can't remember if it's F5 or, nope, that's extend, F6.
And maybe look at this in Anim, where F6 isn't great anymore, or 7 is F7.
I think it actually has it listed on there. Drawing is create empty drawing, Alt-Shift-R. That's easy to remember. So Alt-Shift-R. That's why I have a tendency to just use this little button here. So if I create an empty drawing, you'll see it's red on where my previous drawings were, and I can start doing my next drawing here.
How are you getting the onions to show up in the camera?
So the onion skins, if you click this little button here on the side, and then make sure this little pancake stack is light, this range right along, if you can kind of see where my slider is there, you see how there's that like range on each side of it? That will allow you to change what is visible. So the stuff that's after is going to be green, and the stuff that's before is going to be red. Okay? Yes?
How do I like shorten frames? Because whichever ones I've made, take up the whole frame. And I need to put other ones in between them.
Yes. So you can do that. Hold on a second, let me look at these real quick. So probably the easiest way of doing that is like if I grab this frame and I wanted that to happen earlier, if I click that and just drag it back to there, it will make that frame happen earlier. You kind of have to be careful like how you do this, but you can kind of just slide those around, and then whatever's left on the end here, you can just highlight it and hit delete, and it'll get rid of those.
Wait. What?
So, this exposure, I wish I could zoom in here better. Is there a way to zoom in? So, this exposure right here on frame 12, right? That is my squashed ball drawing, right? If I wanted that to happen on frame 10, if I click on that exposure, right, and drag it backwards to frame 10 and release it, I didn't drag it quite far enough. There we go. Now that exposure starts at frame 10. Now it's going to continue to go all the way out to the end of where it was. So if I wanted to delete those, I could just highlight it and hit delete. Does that make sense? Yes.
My eraser's not working.
On the pen or on the?
I mean, like it'll like register and using the eraser if I want to just like on. I don't know if I'm wrong with this.
Well, let it work on like a film.
So like you know, I'm just like.
Maybe are you drawing with a line or are you drawing with a brush?
It actually did. But like if I go to this one, I don't know if it's okay, now
It may be erasing really tiny. Okay. So I know we're cutting it close. We have exactly 1 minute. And I know that felt pretty, that was a lot, right? So that's why I'm kind of tossing this at you. This is your chance to kind of explore these tools. This is not something that I'm going to be particularly tough on the grading on. More than anything, this is the uncle throws you in the deep end of the pool part of the class, right? Like this is where you have to dive into these drawing tools and figure out how to use them on the timeline. And so just play around with them and try to come in with something. So the project, I'll read it kind of quickly here. In this exercise, you're going to create a frame-by-frame animation of a ball bouncing up and down in place, because the bouncing ball is a very crucial exercise. Most of you have probably already done some variation of this. So you're going to create an animation of a single ball bouncing up and down in an infinite cycle. Take into consideration squash and stretch, ease in and out, solid drawing. The animation can be simple line drawing with a single fill color. If you only get to the line drawing, that's okay, because we had a lot of hiccups today. But try to do the fill color if you want to. Cycle the animation at least 5 times so we can see how it loops. Export the animation. The final deliverable should be an MP4 video. I'll walk you through at the beginning of class. If you come in with your animation ready in Toon Boom, I'll walk you through at the beginning of class how to export that out as a video, including how to put a background color on it so it doesn't just render out as black on black. Right? And this will be due next class period, but like I said, we'll work a little bit together at the beginning of class to sort of get this done. This should be like, it's very simple, just 15, 20 minutes, maybe half an hour of tinkering around and getting used to the tools. So. All right, any questions?
This is already driving me crazy.
Yep, but just like my idea, you'll overcome it. I can show you. Just get the one bounce, and I can show you how to get it to loop and how to export it.
Yes, so if we need you in office hours tomorrow morning.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You're welcome to swing by the office, and I can help you out with it. But really, I mean, that's something to try. Like once you get it to a certain point, try to see if you can figure out how to make it loop. But don't sweat it if what you come in with is not that. More than anything, I just want you practicing using the drawing tools. The bouncing ball seemed like a pretty easy place to do that. So, yes.
I know, right? It's a nice backpack. Very modern small. All the way to I just go downstairs. I was asking tomorrow I actually want to figure out. That was me, but in reverse. I think I would prefer that.
All right, y'all. Sorry, I kind of pushed it to the very last of it. But we're going to get this done. This was just I was trying to cram in as much as I could today. So I'll upload the video if it's helpful at all to YouTube, so kind of watch for that.